Of the three broad approaches in normative ethics, consequentialism, virtue ethics, and deontology, consequentialism is probably the easiest to approach. It also has a lot of different facets that you might decide as a consequentialist, if you like the consequences of a thing, you prefer whose consequences? Your own, others, and then what sort of consequences? All sorts of questions that the different types of consequentialism address. And we will begin that discussion with egoism and classical hedonism today. Really, kind of the one that is easiest to look at first, the consequence that we want to address, is notions of egoism. Uh, Egoism is really simple in many ways. You're going to do what you want to do because you want to do it. Right? It's not about the most people. It's not about anything else other than whether or not the consequences are going to be ones that benefit you. This fits in really well with some of the other discussions we've had and is really kind of easy to see. We end up having people like Nietzsche, who ends up arguing that he's the Übermensch, the overman, and that he's morality and morality itself. There is no morality outside of him. And really, egoism follows on this idea that you need to be about yourself primarily. Now, there's different types of egoists as well. We're going to have notions of psychological egoism as opposed to ethical egoism. Psychological egoism is the view that human beings always enact from a simple way of self-love, that you are, by your very nature, if you want to be or not, an egoist. You're selfish. You care primarily about yourself. Probably an easy example comes from a champion of the notion of psychological egoism, Adam Smith. Now, again, most of you know Adam Smith probably from his discussion of economics. His work, The Wealth of the Nations, is very important for anyone in the economic sphere. But he touched on the issues of morality in his work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in this work, he says that suppose that the great empire of China, with all of its myriads of inhabitants, was suddenly swallowed up by an earthquake. Now, how many, people who have no connection to that part of the world, how would they react upon hearing this news? How would you react if, assuming you don't have any sort of connection to anyone in China or anyone who's over there visiting or anything else along those lines, and you hear that the entire country just got swallowed up in a giant earthquake? Likely you'd say you feel sad that there is some sort of loss in the sake of all of humanity, that the millions of people who died, or billions of people today who've died. It's a catastrophic loss to have an entire nation disappear. And of course, you might donate some money to some relief causes, and you might apply some of this, but really, it's not going to affect you much more than the idea that you're going to feel sad briefly, and then kind of move on with the rest of your day, because largely it doesn't affect you. Now, he's going to say if we compare that to what he calls a frivolous disaster which can befall you, if he says if you were to lose your little finger tomorrow, if I was to inform you that tomorrow you are going to end up losing your little finger, well, most of you, this is a fairly inconsequential loss. I mean, it's a finger, but most of you are not, expert, concert pianists or violinists or anyone else who constantly are using your little finger. So to lose this is just going to be really kind of inconvenient. It's going to be a story you're going to have to tell. It's going to, cost you something. But it's not the end of your life. It's not you can never be the same. You're not a hand model who's losing your career. So this is really, in the grand scheme of things, a fairly small loss. And Adam Smith points out that if you knew this, if it was informed on you that this was going to be the case, that there was no way for you to escape it, you wouldn't sleep tonight. You'd be fretting and fighting and wrestling with yourself. It would take you a long time to get to the point of acceptance that this loss of your little finger is going to happen. And again, it's a loss. It's not huge, but it's a loss. And Adam Smith wants to point out that you're going to have this great disparity between losing of a finger, which most of you aren't using that much anyways, compared to the loss of millions of lives in a foreign land. And this just points out that indeed you are selfish, that your concerns are about you first and foremost. All right, there's a lot of things that can happen all over the world, and you can hear about a lot of horrible stories that happen to other people. And you would admit, most of you, that other people have it far worse than you do. But yet that doesn't take away your problems, right? The pebble in your shoe is important because it's in your shoe. It might just be a pebble, but it's affecting you, right? It might not be the end of the world, but it affects you. And this is the argument from the psychological egoist, that you always act from this idea of self-love, from self-interest, that your primary concern is not in the welfare of humanity. Your primary concern is not in wanting the world to be a better place. Your primary concern is about you and what is going to help and affect you. You might disagree with that, but this is the claim of psychological egoism. Now, psychological egoism is a little bit different from the idea that saying you ought to be selfish, right? Saying that you are selfish and that we have this as a trait is something that many of us might want to overcome and fight against. But there are other people who make the argument that indeed we are selfish. Plato, in his work, The Ring of Gyges, ends up giving this sort of fantastical story of a farmer who, after an earthquake, maybe it's a recurring one, who knows, goes into this giant sort of gorge, and he ends up seeing all of these beautiful statues and gold and whatever, and he ends up picking out a ring, and then coming back up to talk to some of his friends. And while he's talking with some of his friends, about to tell them about this great fortune he sees, he's playing with the ring, and he's kind of spinning the ring around it, and he notices that when the stone is on the outside, his friends are all seeing him and talking to him. But when he turned it facing in, his friends all don't notice him anymore, that he's gone. And he soon discovers that he's invisible. And of course, what does this end up doing? You end up having this sort of advanced sort of cause and discussion along these lines. Plato ends up asking, of course, what are you going to do if you find out that indeed you can become invisible? The story of the Ring of Gyges is the man ends up going off and killing the king, seducing the princess, ends up taking everything he wants. But the question really is, who, according to Plato here, wouldn't just go into the market if they could be invisible and take anything they want? In front of our friends, of course, we would say, no, we don't want to do that. That, of course, that would be an immoral act. But Plato ends up saying that if you're truly invisible, and for the theists, right, let's extend the argument to invisible even to the eyes of God, right, that there's no sort of negative repercussions that can happen. Who doesn't just take what he wants? Plato ends up calling this man a wretched fool, a wretched idiot. That while your friends might praise you to your face, even behind your back, they're saying, no, this is not right. This is not the good idea. That this is not going to be what's going to benefit you. And that this becomes the sort of challenge that that ethical egoism has. While psychological egoism says that you are selfish, ethical egoists argue that indeed you ought to be selfish. That this is the claim, that this is the identity. And Plato in this work, The Ring of Gyges, demonstrates this pretty well. Beyond just what Plato is saying, egoism really advocates that egoism itself is a good thing. That it's not just how we are, but it's how we ought to be. To kind of paraphrase it off of the Oliver Stone movie Wall Street, egoism is good, right? This idea of greed, of wanting more, of wanting to accumulate, wanting security, wanting safety, wanting to excel, are all good things. Now, many of us might say it can get too much, and then the egoist would say if it's too much, then it's not healthy for you, right? It's not just accumulate. If it's going to tear you down and destroy you, then you're not being a good egoist. All right, if it's all about you, you still need to find the balance of what's going to work out well for you. This is the argument that we want. This is what we need to say. This is what egoism is advocating that we do. Indeed, there's a famous story about kind of the good ways of being selfish about Abraham Lincoln. It says that the great emancipator was once on a train with somebody else advocating that we are all selfish. And while he's going across the train, he ends up hearing of some piglets who are stuck in the muck and are going to be die, and the mother sow is squealing while her piglets are stuck. And Abraham Lincoln immediately, stops the train, and he gets out and he helps the piglets out, and then he gets back on the train and talks with his friend. And the guy's saying, "Well, look at this. You just did an unselfish act. You just helped the piglets out." And Abraham Lincoln says, "No, this was the height of selfishness. I wouldn't have been able to sleep tonight if I didn't take care of this." Right? That he was still doing this act, even though it's a good act, even though it's an act for somebody else, out of this idea of still being selfish, that he's still looking out for him and for his wants and his concerns. And so this is kind of the idea that there's sometimes a good way of being selfish. And egoists oftentimes can make this claim, right? That looking out after your own best interests is sometimes helping out others, right? It's not just that you are cut off from the rest of the world and don't care about anybody. In fact, there's even those who make the argument that egoism is beyond simply looking out after yourself, but that egoism is the idea that we should all hold on to. Milton Friedman, the famed economist, ends up having this famous discussion about the pencil. And while he's looking at the pencil, right, he's going to say that no single person could have ever made a pencil. And indeed, this is, at least in part, true. Right? All of the parts, all of the resources that are needed to make a pencil come from all over the world. The graphite comes from some mines, the wood from others, the paint is mixed in one place, the rubber is made on one side of the world while the lumber is treated in another, let alone all of the other tools that are needed to be able to cut the wood, to mine the graphite, to harvest the rubber, and all of the other steps along the way. And that even a simple little thing like a pencil that doesn't cost you very much is based on this idea that everyone is doing what is in their own best interest. The miner, it is in their interest to mine the graphite. They get paid for it. The rubber tree farmer, the same. The lumber mill, the same. Everyone along the way is doing what is in their own interest, and it benefits you, is what Milton Friedman wants to argue. Right? By everyone being selfish, we're going to put away some of our disagreements that we have with other people. Right? There's people all over the world who come into making this tiny little thing called a pencil. People of different races, different religions, different nationalities, different things of what they would say is the most important thing for them in their own life. And yet, they all have this same sort of idea that we're producing this. And that you, by entering into the economic sphere, Milton Friedman argues, are paying, a few minutes of your time for, their entire life's work over and over and over again in large issues of gratitude. And that this becomes the way the cycle works. And that only through egoism can we produce things. Only through egoism will we end up putting aside the things that separate us, and that egoism can help us out along the way. One philosopher and philosophical system that's often tied in with the notions of selfishness is Ayn Rand and her views of objectivism. Objectivism is a 20th century philosophy that begins with the idea that existence exists. While this might not seem novel or weird in any sort of way, it does have a lot of consequences. That reality simply is, and as such we have to live with what is rather than what we may wish it to be. Unlike other philosophers who maintain that Things exist as we interpret them. Objectivism maintains that things exist regardless of how we interpret them, or if we identify them at all. This is, by the way, a direct opposition to philosophers like Berkeley, who argue that the only things that exist are mental constructs or thoughts, or Plato, who argued that there's a realm of ideas and a realm of matter. For objectivism, things simply are. This also eliminates any notion of a supernatural interpretation of events. There's no meaning beyond what is. There's no greater purpose. There's no solution that's going to be done as a result of an event or a material thing. It just is what it is. Ayn Rand states, the primary existence of reality is the axiom that existence exists, i.e., that the universe exists independent of consciousness, of any consciousness. To grasp the axiom that existence exists means to grasp the fact that nature, i.e., the universe as a whole, cannot be created or annihilated, that it cannot come into or out of existence, whether its basic constituent elements are atoms or subatomic particles, or some yet undiscovered forms of energy. It is not ruled by a consciousness or a will or by chance, but by the law of identity. Nature is the metaphysically given, i.e., the nature of nature is outside of the power of any volition, outside of any notion of will, we would say. And she says this in the metaphysical verses of the man-made. So again, this idea that we just see what is and there's nothing else there, that how we look at things, how we approach things is the given in the situation. Of course, this will impact our notions of ethics as well. If there's no meaning behind suffering, and suffering is just suffering, if there's no meaning behind a good deed, and it's simply a deed that is done, then what do we owe our neighbor? What do we owe ourselves? If there's no supernatural artisan who created the world, we don't owe God anything either. Right? There's nothing more than what's given. How we evaluate what's moral must come about by what is, not what we believe it ought to be. Therefore, we ought not then to deny our own interests to serve God or others. For Rand, the purpose of morality is to teach us what is in our own self-interest, what produces our happiness, and as such, we ought to be selfish. Quote, the objectivist ethics holds that the actor must always be the beneficiary of his actions, that man must for his own rational self-interest, but his right to do so is derived from his nature as man and from the function of moral values in human life, and therefore is applicable only in the context of a rational, objectively demonstrated and validated code of moral principles which define and determine his actual self-interest. Take a quick break side. We see that you create your own morals to figure out what is in your self-interest, and that is also then kind of what is moral. It's not the same as Nietzsche, but it does have some overlap there. Continuing her quote, it is not a license to do as he pleases, and it is not applicable to the altruist's image of a selfish brute, nor any man motivated by irrational emotions, feelings, urges, wishes, or whims. So we get this in the introduction to the virtue of selfishness. And even the title of that work tells us something. There's a virtue for Ayn Rand in being selfish, that this is what is the good thing, that there's value in it. Different objectivists have all rallied to these ideas that Ayn Rand has created and have a society surrounding her, where they start to question and look at what we otherwise would see as a good selflessness, giving of ourself to others, a sort of ethics of self-sacrifice that most of us, through religious teachings and others, or even things just like utilitarianism, tell us we ought to be selfless. giving of ourselves to others and not be selfish. The society that follows Ayn Rand ended up taking a couple of steps a little bit farther, and one of them penned an argument to this effect, stating that a genocide like the Holocaust will happen again unless we learn that the root cause of the Nazis' evil was self-sacrifice. That genocide has gone unabated and unchecked, and this is because the usual analysis of these bloodbaths is focused on the effects and not on the causes, and they view this as the cause of self-sacrifice, self-abnegation, getting rid of yourself as the highest identity. Really, they make the argument that it was the Germans' acceptance of the philosophy of collectivism and the morality of sacrificing the individual to the nation that allowed the Nazis to subject the Jews to the horrors of the concentration camps. There becomes this long history in German ethos, in Prussianism, of sacrifice for a greater good. Now, originally, this was all in service of God, and then comes a little bit of notions of service to the state, but it's this idea of sacrifice. And once sacrifice is viewed as a self-evident virtue, the argument is made that there's no amount of this virtue that can ever be condemned as too much. It is to be a good German to sacrifice yourself, even if it's leading to genocide. Now, we might have a lot of arguments against this, saying, okay, you're overstating things, there was those people who fought back, etc., in the camps, that it wasn't all entirely self-sacrifice as a virtue that was being poured out. But this is the sort of objectivist sort of response of taking this to this extreme, that the second that we don't care about ourselves, that we follow what others tell us we ought to do as opposed to our own self-interest, the second that we relegate our own interests of what we actually truly know to be our own interests because of some notion of some virtue that's created through some force or nation. We're not taking things as they are, but what they might ought to be. Then, of course, all sorts of evils can follow, and we can go way too far in this. Egoism and all of its different forms is just one expression of consequentialist morality. Consequentialists, again, look at the consequences of things as opposed to notions of duty or virtue kind of imposing what is moral. And egoists really look at how these affect me in my life. You as the agent are the one that determines if something is moral. Again, different forms of this will look at it in different ways. Hedonists will talk about the amount of pleasure that we have, and that life is really ruled by the pleasure-pain sort of calculus, and it's still about you, but it's about the pleasure you're getting. Utilitarians kind of open this up a little bit more and talk about the maximum pleasure and minimum amount of pain for the majority of people. And there's also some theists that we would identify as consequentialists, that God has the only intrinsic value and everything's about these eternal consequences and how we relate to it. For egoists, hedonists, utilitarianism, and some theists, it's still about the consequences as opposed to any inherent value that's determining what is moral and what is not. Hedonism is really one of the older philosophies. In fact, it was identified as a philosophy of life in ancient Greece. It's not just what you're getting in the moment, but it's structuring how you approach everything. Other rival forms of philosophies of life in ancient Greece would include notions of Stoicism and Cynicism, skepticism being kind of within that group as well. But Epicurus, the sort of classical founder of hedonism, states that philosophy is an activity which by argument and discussion brings about a happy life. The Stoics talked about the art of the useful, right? That this is something that's going to incorporate all of your life. It's trying to figure out what is real value for you. Now, for hedonism, following Epicurus, the idea is that pleasure And self-indulgence is really what's virtuous. Now, what is self-indulgence and what is pleasurable becomes a different sort of discussion. There's a lot more nuance wrapped up in with this. It's the ethical theory that pleasure, in the sense of satisfaction of your desires, is the highest good and proper aim of human life. In fact, the term hedonism itself comes from the Greek word for pleasure. The movement, which will grow out of Epicurus, starts with a very simple question. Do you want to be happy? Do you? This is actually a fairly serious question, although most of us will just reflexively say, yeah, duh. Well, if you do want to indeed be happy, what's standing in your way? What obstacles exist between you and being happy? Your happiness is entirely up to you. The fundamental obstacle to your happiness is your own anxiety, your own pushing back, your own self. If you're anxious over your health, you'll get sick. If you're anxious over your food, you will not be satisfied. If you're anxious over the next life, you're not going to live this one. The key to be happy are the four truths of Epicureanism, or the four-part cure, as it is known. The four-part cure are, at least in parts, things that you may accept today. The first of which is that there's no divine beings which threaten us. Now, this is one that you may accept or you may reject, but this is the first step in understanding Epicureanism, is essentially your life is your own. You're not in some sort of elaborate divine illusion. The second is kind of a continuation, that there is no next life. Or, broader speaking, if there is, you don't know anything about it. So why bother stressing about it? If you don't know about the next life, Epicurus and others will say, then why are you concerning yourself with what's going to happen next? Can you concern yourself with what's going to happen now? The third point is that what you actually need is easy to get. What do you actually need? What do you actually need? That list is fairly short. Food, not luxurious food, just basic food. You don't need lobster and a T-bone steak. You need water. You don't need fancy wine and champagne. Right? Just basic food, basic drink. You need shelter. How much shelter? Not much. 500 square feet is probably sufficient. You don't need a 4,000 square foot McMansion. Right? You need basic shelter. Some of you might have larger families and maybe need a little bit more space, but how much do you need? Versus how much would you like or want? Most of us say, well, I need more space because I got all my stuff. Where's all my stuff going to go? I need a bigger house. Well, do you need all that stuff? Probably not. You like that stuff, but you don't need it. And so that's part of the thoughts. You need to figure out how little you actually need and enjoy possessing that, knowing you will continue to possess it. Epicurus will also die of kidney failure and was in great pain. And this kind of leads us to that fourth point of the movement, is that what makes us suffer is easy to put up with. What's interesting is, right, he dies of great pain, but yet part of his movement is that what makes us suffer is easy to put up with. And he would continue this even during his death, which may have been, again, at his own hand, right? Death doesn't need to be worried about. While pain exists, you can choose to endure it or focus on what you have. He focused on his friends, during this time of suffering. And therefore, he can endure his suffering because he had his friends with him. Death is a big obstacle for most of us. It's something that we think about, or at least something we think we should think about. Right? Epicurus says that you do not need to be worried about it. In fact, there's a statement for Epicureans that death is nothing to us. Death is nothing. This was often put on rings and on mirrors to encourage his followers not to worry about death. While you are alive, you're not dead. And when you're dead, you'll deal with what it is to be dead then. Therefore, there's no reason for you to concern yourself about being dead. And since most of us worry about the next life, to simply say death is nothing. Even though Epicurus was familiar with death, it was all around him. This wasn't as hidden as it is in the modern era, right? Most of you haven't been to that many funerals, if any. And if you've been to them, not all of you have had open caskets. Not all of you have touched the body of the person who's there and dead. You haven't seen death. You hear about death. Now, some of you, this doesn't apply to. But for our culture, we don't know death. We don't see death. Our food comes from the supermarket, not from the feedlots. We don't see the death of the food that we eat. We don't see the death of the friends that we have. Again, some of us do, but most of us don't. As a culture, we pretend death doesn't exist, but then death becomes everything. We're overly concerned about an illness we could catch that could kill us, or we're overly concerned with an idea that we are mortal, that we construct large systems to pretend that it's not the case. Increasingly, we might not even be religious to think about what's the next life, because we don't want to think about death. And yet, there are those who argue that we're a culture of death on top of that, so oddly, kind of a mix of both. We thrive on it and yet are fearful of it and also completely ignorant of it. But for Epicurus and the Greeks and later Romans who are adopting his system, they're very familiar with death. They saw death. They held the bodies of loved ones who died. They know death could come around at any moment and get them. Right? Pre-antibiotics, etc. Right? Oops, sorry, you got an infection. You're dead. So the idea is, yeah, you might die at any moment, but death is nothing. What do you need? You need to live this life. Your sufferings are easy to put up with. There's not some grand cosmic scheme to ruin you and destroy you. The root of these concerns, be it the future or death, or even the issue of God and what the gods care about, really comes down to a question of desires. And this is where he points his attention in the fourth teaching. Right? What is it that you desire? What is it that we should desire? Some things you want in life, but you have no reason to. What you really desire is happiness. What happiness really is, according to Epicurus, is freedom from pain and fear. This tranquility is both of the mind and of the body. If you want to avoid pain and fear, don't want things that either possessing could cause pain or fear, or lacking them because you want them will cause you pain and fear. Therefore, it would be best to not have them so you don't worry about the loss of them. But yet, many of us still want these things. Our desires are at odds with themselves. For Epicurus, pleasure is the alpha and omega of a happy life. When we are pained, pleasure then, and then only, do we feel the need for pleasure. For this reason, we call pleasure the alpha and omega of a happy life. Pleasure is our first and kindred good. It is the starting point of every choice and every aversion. And to it we come back inasmuch as we make feeling the rule by which we judge of every good thing. And since pleasure is our first and native good, for that reason we do not choose every pleasure whatever, but often pass over many pleasures with greater annoyance ensures from them. Right? We don't take every sort of pleasure because not every pleasure is really going to be pleasurable for you. You know that to live a pleasurable life, sometimes you have to say no to one and yes to another. You have to make choices. But it doesn't mean that that other thing is bad. It just means that it is not the best good. And so part of what we need to do to try to make sure we have a happy life is to know what's going to be the most pleasurable. So do you drink the expensive wine? It's good, but will that ruin your taste for basic cheap wine? Maybe. Can you always afford the good wine? If not, maybe it's better to never drink it to begin with. At least this was part of what Epicurus was advocating for with his diet of cheap wine and basic bread. He was content. He was happy. He didn't think, oh, this is horrible. He thought, this is pleasurable. This is making my life happy. This is what things are. Not all pains are equal, neither are all pleasures. There are some pleasures that only can exist because of pain, and some pleasures that only lead to pain. They're not all equal, and while pleasure might be seen as good to us, not all pleasure is worthy of choice and doing. Just as not all pain is an evil that needs to be eliminated and shunned. You can probably think of some bad pleasures, some guilty pleasures, some things that you do that are not good for you. And it doesn't lead to further pleasure. It usually only leads to pain, discomfort, irritability, something. And maybe it causes distrust in your emotional well-being or psychological well-being or spiritual or physical because you indulged in one pleasure over another. Similarly, there are good pains. Saying no to a bad event, a bad thing, is a pain because it might have seemed like fun, but you're saying no to it. Or the pain of lifting weights afterwards, right? That you are a little sore, but you know it's a good pain because your body is gaining strength. There's value in that. We can't always see pain as equal to evil and pleasure is always good, even as an Epicurean who sees pleasure as the alpha and omega of life, because not all pains are equal, neither are all pleasures. That we have to measure one against the other, and that's how we need to judge these. Which one leads to more and which one leads to less. So it's not just the momentary indulgence, and that's why the classical ease of approach towards hedonism, the view that Stoics and others will put on it, doesn't fit within the broader philosophical system because it doesn't actually work that way. So what does this all mean? Where are we supposed to go with that? When we say that pleasure is, in the end, the aim, we do not mean pleasures of the prodigal or pleasures of sensuality, as we understood as they do for some through ignorance, prejudice, or willful misrepresentation. What we mean by pleasure is absence of the body and trouble in the soul. It is not an unbroken succession of drinking bouts and merrymaking, not sexual love, not the enjoyment of fish and other delicacies of a luxurious table which produce a pleasant life. This is not what we're looking after. We need pleasures that are going to remove pains, present and in the future. We need to find pleasures that don't disturb our soul. We need pleasures that are not derived from addiction, where you have to have it. But what if the only cost of adding to it is that you're addicted to what you like? Is that okay? Like coffee and caffeine? Generally speaking, they say the only real negative effect of caffeine is that your body wants caffeine. So as long as you get it, you're okay. In fact, there's benefits to that other end. So how's that going to work, right? Lots and lots of studies out there, but that's generally the result of that. Right? You drink as much coffee as you want, as long as it's not too much. All you're really going to want is more coffee. What about habits? Are habits good? Are they beneficial? What about the runner or the gym rat? Right? If you miss a day of running or lifting, you feel uncomfortable with yourself. Are these okay? It's strengthening your body in one way or the other. It's making you feel better overall, so it's got real value. But is this pleasurable then in this way? Maybe. You got to kind of evaluate some of this on your own. How do you know which pleasures disturb your soul and which ones are actually beneficial? The answer to this is sober reasoning, searching out the grounds of every choice and avoidance, banishing those beliefs which the greatest disturbances take possession of our soul. We need sober reasoning. So what do we do with that? Prudence, he says, is more precious thing than all of the other virtues. A life of pleasure which is not also a life of prudence, honor, and justice will not lead to pleasure, honor, nor justice. We need to be prudent with our choices. We need to weigh them out, which takes, again, loving wisdom. You need to know which one is there. Now, the aim isn't just to be wise. The aim is to have a happy life, to be pleasurable. But you need to know through wisdom which actions are prudent and which ones are going to actually benefit you and your soul. So what does hedonism mean then? How should we look at hedonism if it isn't just the pleasures of the prodigal, if it's not just getting every single little bit of pleasure we can? Is it closer to Epicurus, who says that we want pleasures and that these are actually easy to get? We just need to limit our desires. Your desires should be reasonable and attainable. Or is it the popular depiction of gluttony, sex, and opulence? Right? These are two different extremes of what most of us think about when we approach notions of hedonism. We have the higher Epicurean philosophical sort, and we have the base, just giving in to any sort of indulgence. Epicurus passed on these things because he didn't think that it would make him happy. And happiness is the aim to this life. This is why Epicurean hedonism is a philosophy of life that we have to navigate by following all of these different rules and expectations. So this becomes a question for you when you're wanting to address notions of hedonism, if indeed you think that this is an ethical system at all. But notice that even under one broad category of hedonism, we have different extremes of bread, cheap wine, occasionally cheese, as opposed to complete gluttony and vomiting multiple times a day, and all of these sorts of extremes that people will think of today with notions of hedonism. There seems to be some overlap between egoism and hedonism, after all, both of which kind of put you in the driver's seat of what counts as pleasure, what's actually in your best interest. But again, some of that's up to opportunities. Hedonists have lots of opportunities, and classical, following Epicurus, don't always follow them. While Plato would call you a fool for not taking all that you could. Of course, we also have a similar sort of debate between Nietzsche and his notion of being the Übermensch, that I am morality in itself, and Ayn Rand's notions of objectivism. Can you apply either of these to those other larger systems, or are these all four independent ideas?
Can you be one, both of the broader ones, both of the lower ones, or all? Or do you not like the idea of consequentialism, or not consequentialism that places you as the center?